and learn more about the intertidal life in the Gulf of Maine. All right, so a short overview so you know what to expect for tonight. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about myself before we dive right into the life in the intertidal zone. We will talk about what that word means, what it's like to live in that area, and then specifically we will talk about what sort of species live in the Gulf of Maine that you can find pretty commonly there and how they are adapted to the life there, which there's some pretty crazy adaptations. And then finally, we will talk about some tips and tools for tide pooling if you're inspired by this presentation and you decide you want to go out this summer and try to find these creatures for yourself. And then I'll leave some time for questions at the end. Do we have any questions right off the bat or issues? Awesome. All right, before we go any further, it's really important to acknowledge that the land we're talking about tonight, so the intertidal zone in the Gulf of Maine, this land is part of the traditional homelands of the Wabanaki Confederacy, which includes the Abenaki, the Penobscot, the Passamaquoddy, the Micmac, and the Maliseet people. These people have stewarded the land and continue to steward the land today. And it's really important to not only acknowledge that, but realizing that acknowledgement is only that first step, and really building relationships is a really important part of that sort of land acknowledgement with Indigenous people. So at Hog Island Audubon Camp, we've been working with the Wabanaki Confederacy and partnering on some projects, as well as doing some community outreach and other partnerships. Right. A little bit more about myself. Again, my name is Amanda Leemann. I'm a seasonal naturalist and educator and marine enthusiast. So I move around a lot. I've lived in different places, working in different areas, but generally I interpret nature for people. That can be adults. It might look like leading boat trips or bird tours at Hog Island Audubon Camp, which I do a lot, or it looks like taking kids, students out on trips where we go tide pooling or we go hiking, or as you can see in this picture, presenting a great horned owl to a group of kiddos. So my work takes a lot of different forms, but I really enjoy working and teaching everyone about nature. I'm also a budding artist and scientific illustrator. I recently did a few commission pieces that included a sticker for a bird nonprofit in New Jersey and an intertidal mural in California where I worked, featuring the Central California critters. And I've done a lot of nature journaling, seaweed pressing, and then colored pencil and ink drawing. So if you're interested in learning more about my work as an artist, you can check out my Instagram account. And with that, we're going to jump into the intertidal zone. So if you haven't heard that word before, we're going to break it down into two parts. Inter, meaning between, and tidal, meaning the tides. So it's pretty much the zone between high tide and low tide. And you can think of that as a large area if you're on like a big sandy beach, or you can think of that as a rocky area or a mud flat, but anywhere between high tide and low tide. And within that intertidal zone, you can break it down into more specific categories. You can talk about the high tide intertidal zone or the low tide intertidal zone. And this determines what sort of critters are going to live in that area. Is it going to be covered with water most of the time and only every now and then exposed? Or is it going to be exposed to the air most of the time and covered with water just a little bit? That really determines what you find and what sort of creatures are able to live there. Here's a visual example with a picture of kind of that like tidal zonation, where this is from Hog Island Audubon Camp. We take all of our campers out in a intertidal exploration session where this was a family camp. So we had kids and adults and sometimes grandparents all out together just exploring. And you can see there's people in all the different intertidal zones going on here. So way at the end, you can see I put an L there that marks the low tide zone. So that's an area that's mostly covered by water, only accessible by walking at low tide. and then compared to the M for like a mid-tide zone that is available at mid-tide. And then H is mostly available for walking because it is not covered by water except for during high tides or like a storm. And the reason I'm showing you kind of these pictures is so that you have a reference for if you want to go tide pooling and find certain critters. I've included a lot of pictures of the species that live in the Gulf of Maine. And on the bottom corner of all of these pictures, I've kind of put a little label that says, where are you most likely to find these animals? Do you have to go at a really low tide, or can you go anytime and find this creature at a high tide? So if that's something you're interested in, you can pay attention to where you might find these creatures. All right, we are going to talk a little bit, before we talk about species, what sort of challenges do intertidal creatures face? So an example of this could be like crashing waves. If it's a really strong storm and you're a creature that lives on the rocks, you don't want to get smashed by a wave and you don't want to get pulled out to sea. So that is a type of challenge that an intertidal organism might face. I'm going to put you all on the spot and I'm going to ask you, take about 20 seconds and think about in your head what other challenges might these creatures face, and go ahead and type them into the chat. And I'm going to try to watch that. Okay, I can see you all. So any sort of examples? All right. I'm not seeing any yet, but that is okay because we are going to talk about them. Oh, drying out in the sun. That's a great one.
Can you see them now, Amanda?
I see one.
Okay, we have predators, pollution, rising average temperatures, wave action, water temp, oil spill, water fluctuations.
Wonderful. I wonder why I wasn't seen before. I am not sure.
I think because they can only share it all with me. So.
I gotcha. Well, thank you for reading those. Those are great. So those are really good examples. Yes, indeed. Some of them that we talked about, again, waves, really big challenge if you're living in an area that's being crashed by waves. And then the other four on this screen, they all go hand in hand. I want you to imagine if you're an animal that lives in a tide pool, once the water recedes, once the tide goes out, you're going to be in a little pool of water, maybe some seaweed, maybe surrounded by some rocks, and the sun comes out. It's a hot day. Suddenly, your water is going to warm up, and you're going to have to deal with higher temperature water. Now, if you have higher temperature water, the oxygen level of that water automatically goes down because more dissolved oxygen can be held in colder water. So not only do you have warmer water, you also have less oxygen. And as water warms up, it's going to evaporate and it's going to leave behind saltier water. So then you have a higher salinity. You have lots of challenges. And if the whole tide pool dries up altogether, you could face drying out or desiccation. So those are some big challenges that creatures have to adapt to, either being able to withstand those or use their legs or fins to move to a different area to get back in the water. Some other challenges include the possibility of getting inundated by fresh water, right? If you're open to the sky and it starts to rain, your tide pool could fill up with fresh water, which is very different than living in salt water. You are subject to any sort of runoff pollution. It's going to come off of the land and hit the intertidal zone first. And so it's going to be most concentrated at that intertidal zone before it kind of spreads out into the open ocean. And also predators, as already you mentioned. Not only predators from the ocean, right, as the high tide comes in, the predators can come from the ocean, but predators can come from land during low tide. And always, predators can come from the air because it's a pretty shallow area. A lot of predators, a lot of birds are able to dive into that intertidal zone. So you have 3 sets of different predators you have to watch out for, as well as all of these other factors. And that makes the intertidal zone a really hard place to live in, but it also makes it a place where a lot of creatures have developed so many different ways of surviving, and it's one of the most diverse areas to find different species because of those challenges. All right, so on the flip side, we're going to talk a little bit about what sort of common adaptations do creatures use to overcome these challenges. So an adaptation being a physical characteristic or behavior that has evolved in that species over thousands of years that helps them survive in that specific area. So for example, a snail has evolved to create its own shell, right? That gives protection against predators, but it also protects against desiccation because they're able to seal themselves in their shell. So that is an example of an adaptation. And again, I'm going to give you all 20 seconds, and then Alicia's going to read the chat. Brainstorm a few adaptations that you can think of for intertidal critters. All right, are we seeing any, Alicia? Alicia, sorry.
Yep. We've got camouflage and hiding, shells, sperm attachment, digging to hide, and swimming to hide.
Amazing. Y'all are on it. Know your critters. So yes, a lot of those are very well used in the intertidal zone. Camouflage, right? To blend in with your surroundings. We've got shells that provides protection and from desiccation. Certain animals, the arthropod group has exoskeletons, which is a little bit different than a shell, but it still provides that structure and a little bit of support. And then a lot of organisms in the intertidal zone use toxins to defend themselves and to get their prey. If you've ever been stung by a jellyfish, I'm sure you can attest to the toxins. And that is a common characteristic of marine animals, especially in the intertidal zone. As well as things like you already mentioned, suction or a special type of glue that really lodges something onto a rock so that it cannot be torn off by a predator or by crashing waves. And then depending who you are, what kind of critter you are, you might have gills, lungs, legs, fins, a combination of those. Certain fish can use their gills as lungs, and certain, critters that have lungs can breathe underwater. So it kind of goes back and forth. And there's, advantages and disadvantages to having each of those traits. All right. Today, we're going to think about those challenges, think about those adaptations, and we're going to talk about the common species in the Gulf of Maine and how they specifically are adapted to life in the intertidal zone. We could spend hours and hours talking about intertidal life in general, and I would love to, but for the sake of tonight, we're just going to talk about some of the common species in the Gulf of Maine. All right, so we're going to start with fish. There are two species of fish that are really common to find just going tide pooling. You don't even really need to get your feet wet. One is the sculpin, which you can see here on the right, and the second is the gunnelfish, which also has the nickname rock eel. And they are not eels. They are fish, but they do look very much like eels, and they make a slithering motion when you pick up a rock and they are exposed underneath it. They're like, oh my gosh, I gotta hide. And gunnelfish are really cool in that they have a special adaptation that allows them to stay out of water and breathe air, even though they are fish, for up to 20 hours. So when the tide goes out, they are fine. As long as they are kind of under a rock or under some seaweed and not in the full sun, they are going to be able to breathe. They also have this like slime coating on their bodies that helps them stay moist, kind of like a snail would, so that they don't dry out in the sun or in the air. So I always encourage people, if you find a fish in the intertidal zone and you want to take a closer look, put it in like a bucket of water or a bowl or something instead of in your hands, because if it is a gunnelfish, it will rub some of that slime off. And then when you put that fish back in, wherever it was, if it was low tide, it might dry out pretty easily. So cool adaptation that the gunnelfish have. All right. Now we're talking about the sponges, very different. The rest of these categories are all animals that are invertebrates, meaning they don't have a backbone. So they look very different than us, but they live on the same planet and they are doing their daily lives in the intertidal zone in very, very fascinating ways. So the sponges, they are filter feeders. And that means they draw in water through their bodies. They have little holes in their bodies called porocytes, and they basically suck in the water, filter it out. They get plankton and bacteria and viruses, and that is the substance that they use for their food, and then they shoot it back out once they're finished filtering it. A sponge can filter about 6 times its weight in water per minute, which is a lot of water. So they are constantly pumping water through their bodies. And you can see the network of holes, these porocytes, can be really beautiful. So I encourage, if you ever find a sponge, don't be afraid to like get down close and really look at it, because they are fascinating. And also give it a little poke, because they really do feel like the texture of a dish sponge. All right. Well, I forgot to mention, these are the 2 most common species in the Gulf of Maine, the crumb of bread sponge, or the breadcrumb sponge, and the purple encrusting sponge. They often are at like really low intertidal zones, and you gotta either flip over rocks or look behind seaweed. All right, now we've got a different group of organisms called the cnidarians. These include animals like jellyfish, anemones, corals, hydroids, and there's more, but those are the main ones that we'll talk about. Corals, no, but I just threw them in there so you can have some perspective. These animals all share characteristics of having like a squishy gelatinous body, and they use stinging cells and toxins to adapt, get their prey, or to deter predators. You can see a diagram of the cnidocytes, which are the stinging cells, in the bottom right, and you can see how they have little barbs on them so that when they shoot into that creature, they're able to inject the toxins easily because they stick in that creature's skin. The only animal in the Gulf of Maine that could sting you, or the only cnidarian that you would need to worry about like toxins, is the Atlantic lion's mane, which is on the left, and they can be pretty small. This one was pretty small. They can be bigger, and they tend to kind of come in when the tide is moving in. You'll see like a whole bunch of them just kind of drifting all at once, and they can sting humans. So that is something to keep in mind. But other than that, we don't have a lot of like stinging corals or stinging anemones, which is really nice when you're going tide pooling. The type of anemone that we have most commonly, unfortunately, is a non-native species, the green striped anemone, and they can be really, really small, or they are really small. I think the biggest they get is 3 centimeters, which is not very big, but they still are really pretty, and they're still anemones, so you can see their little tentacles open up in the water. The giant green anemone that I put on here, we do not have in Maine, but I added it because it has a really cool adaptation that several different anemones have, that I wanted to highlight because it's just so fascinating. These anemones actually invite a certain species of algae into their bodies, into their cells, and they give the algae a safe place to live, a safe haven. And in return, the algae gives them some nutrients. And this gives them that green color. And if you go into like a sea cave or an area that doesn't get any light, you'll notice that all of the anemones are not green. They are white because algae can't photosynthesize without sun. So if there's no sun, the algae's not going to want to live in those anemones. Pretty cool adaptation that they have figured out. Oh, and to mention that the green striped anemone, again, does not sting humans. You can touch it. All right. Hydroids is a different type of cnidarian. Still, got those stinging cells, gelatinous body. This one is really fascinating. You can see in the picture, it looks like a hermit crab with a fuzzy carpet of orange stuff on its back. And if you zoom in on that carpet looking thing, you will notice it's not part of the shell. It's actually a creature growing on top of the shell. And these are individual hydroids, which are animals. So individual animals growing on the back of this shell. They have tiny little tentacles that they stick out to capture their prey. And they just exist and in our world. And I love finding them. You'll see like hermit crabs that just are strangely orange, and you pick them up and you realize, oh yeah, this is a hydroid growing on here. So if you ever find one, definitely you can see it with your naked eye, but I would encourage, find a hand lens or something to get a really good look at that hydroid. All right, gonna check how we're doing on time. So the mollusks are another group of organisms that encompasses a really large category like snails and limpets and clams and mussels and octopus. We are only going to talk about some of the common ones in the Gulf of Maine, but they mostly have a soft body and a hard shell is kind of the broad characteristic of this group. One of my favorite mollusks to find in the intertidal zone is a limpet, and they're kind of look boring on the outside. So you can see this species kind of in the middle left, and they attach themselves to rocks. And on the underside, they've got their soft body. So you can see why they would want to have that shell on top. And they actually can grind their shells into the rock over time to create a little perfect groove that fits their bodies. And that becomes their safe haven and their home. And each time it's high tide, they go out to forage, they scrape algae off of the rocks, they will come back to that exact spot and nestle in their little hole or their little groove because it fits their shell so well, which is really cool. And scientists have found that like a 2-inch limpet can withstand over 100 pounds of pressure, like trying to pull it off the rock. I always challenge my students when I'm tide pooling with kids. See that limpet over there? See if you can pull it off the rock. And they're like, oh, yeah, I can do it. They can't do it. It's really hard. So that's an advantage for those limpets to stay safe. I also like to highlight for mollusks in general is the fact that they make their own shells. Usually we see shells if we go to the beach and they're washed up on the shore, or we see them in a fancy gift shop and we marvel at them that way. But at least for me, I usually forget that there's actually an animal that made that shell out of nothing, which is not an adaptation that I have. I wish I could do that. But mollusks basically take proteins and minerals out of the water, and they're able to solidify it into this shell formation with a special organ. So making a shell out of nothing sounds really cool, and it's just a very neat adaptation that mollusks have adapted to for many, many years. And then I want to highlight, you can see on the kind of middle right, there's a set of mollusk eggs. That's a really common thing to find in the intertidal zone in Maine. So if you're turning over rocks, you'll notice like these little yellow kind of shaped eggs. They're really hard, like glued onto there, and you can touch them. They're not really going to come off. Obviously, don't try to rip them off. But then you can come back in a few days and see if they're still there, or see if they've hatched into tiny little baby snails, which would be planktonic. So you wouldn't see them crawling around, but you could see the empty like egg cases, which is pretty cool. All right. Another thing about mollusks that I think is cool, I did have a video of this, but it was having trouble playing, so I put some pictures in, is that all mollusks have this special tool in their mouth. They have a whole bunch of teeth, like hundreds of teeth, attached to this spinning disc, and it is called a radula, and it is able to scrape off like really thin layers of algae, and that is their food source. And you can often see this if you look in like an aquarium or something, or in this case, it was the side of our marine touch tank that we have. And you can see this radula, looks like a little circle scraping out. And then you'll notice the snail leaving a trail of clean glass with no algae behind it as it goes, which is pretty cool. All right, I would be amiss if I didn't talk about clams, at least a little bit, because clams are really important for Maine and for a lot of clammers. And clams are really cool as a type of mollusk. Not only do they have their shell to hide in, but they have buried themselves in the mud, and that is how they survive. So they will dig down pretty deep. It depends on the species, can go really deep. And they will take part of their body called a siphon and stick it all the way up through the mud until they can reach the water. And if you're walking along the top, you might only see, like this bottom photo, the very top of the siphon and think, what the heck? But that's the feeding structure of that clam as they are filtering the water and sucking it in and then exposing it on the other side. So if you see that, it's pretty fun to like touch it because it'll squirt out water and then withdraw into its little cavity because it says, please don't eat me. So definitely look for clam siphons. You can use a clam rake to dig for some clams. And the other reason why I like to mention clams, mollusks, really just invertebrates in general in the intertidal zone is that they're a really important food source for birds, especially shorebirds. And our shorebirds need a lot of protection. So by protecting them, we also protect the intertidal habitat that is a major food source for them. I really like this picture because it shows why those clams want to dig so deep. They want to get out of the way of that whimbrel that's about to eat them. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't mind just being up near the surface. It's a lot easier. All right. A different group of organisms is the arthropods. And you might be familiar with arthropods on land. We have many of them, but they are also marine creatures, things like crabs and lobsters and shrimp and barnacles. And they have those exoskeletons. So it's kind of a chitinous skeleton that gives them some protection and rigidity since they don't have a backbone. One of the common arthropods to find in little tide pools is called a prawn. And a lot of people think, oh, it's a baby shrimp. It does look like a shrimp. It's a full-grown adult species, though. It's called a prawn, and they are related to shrimp, but they are full-grown. They're really, really cute. And then also the sandhopper. You can find sandhoppers at really high tide, at any tide level, because they actually live up on the beach where there's kind of like piles of decaying seaweed, and they're helping to break down that seaweed. And a lot of times people mistake them for sand fleas, which bite humans, and they're not fun. But sandhoppers do not bite us. They simply jump on us and think, you're not seaweed, I'm out of here, and they jump back. But it can be alarming if you're moving on the beach and suddenly a whole bunch of bug-looking creatures start jumping on your legs. But those are sandhoppers, and they are harmless. All right, another type of barnacle, another type of arthropod that I love showing people is barnacles. If you've never watched a barnacle feed, you have to look up a video of a barnacle feeding. It is really, really cool. Again, I had a video, but it wasn't working, so I'm putting some pictures on here. But barnacles don't look like much when they're out of the water. They close up these plates to protect themselves from drying out. But when the tide comes in and they are surrounded by water, they will open these plates and they will have a certain like feathery looking leg structure called cirri that comes out. And they are filtering the water for plankton and other little nutrients that they are eating. And they will bring that cirri back in to kind of clean off their little feathery structures and get all of the nutrients out. So barnacles, really cool, even though they don't look like much out of the water. All right, so tunicates is another group of organisms that you may or may not have heard of before. I think they're really cool. They're really weird. They're mostly like little watery sacs that are also filter feeders, but they have many different shapes and sizes and colors, and you could spend a lot of time looking at tunicates. But the common ones that we find in the Gulf of Maine are like sea vases and sea squirts, which you can see in the right. They have those little openings. One pulls in the water and then one shoots out the water. And then the colonial tunicates on the right-hand side, or on the left-hand side, excuse me, are really, really cool to see up close because these organisms live in a colonial fashion. And if you zoom in, each one of those flowery looking structures is a zooid. So a individual animal is each one of those. And then together they make this colony. And unfortunately, the golden star tunicate is a pretty invasive species in the Gulf of Maine. However, that doesn't mean you can't still appreciate its beauty if you do see it. I really like looking up close, putting it under the microscope or using a hand lens and looking just to see the patterns and the structure of these tunicates. Another place that tunicates like to live is on lobster traps, and those lobstermen are not happy about it. This was a lobster trap that we have in at the Hog Island Audubon Camp that we have under our dock, and we use to collect creatures for our marine touch tank for education. And the lobster trap was left in the water for 2 weeks, and it was taken over by tunicates. And when I went to pull that lobster trap up, it was heavy. Wow. And because all those tunicates are filled with water. So lobstermen do not appreciate that. And after I took this picture, I did have to sit there and scrape off all the tunicates. Otherwise, the trap would just be way too heavy to keep pulling up. So if you zoom in on that, you can see how those little sac-like filter feeders, they're all kind of clustered together just on that lobster trap. All right, this is a heads up for those of you out there. I know some people get a little bit squeamish about worms. If that is you, you can just avert your eyes for the next couple slides because I'm going to talk about marine worms. But if you're a little bit like, oh, I don't know, I would challenge you to pay attention because they can be really, really beautiful and you might be surprised. All right. So marine worms, you might think, why are they spending time talking about this? They're just worms. That's what I thought a couple years ago. I was thinking of like earthworms where they're brown. They just kind of lay there. And I thought, what's so exciting about that? And then I had this coworker in Alaska where I was working who was obsessed with marine worms. And she told me some really cool facts. And she told me this adaptation that a lot of marine worms, including the clam worm that we can find in the Gulf of Maine, they have this crazy set of teeth. You think worms have teeth? Yes, marine worms have teeth. And they are located in like this circle on a proboscis that they usually keep tucked inside their mouth. And then when they want to bite something, they extrude their proboscis. I have a picture of this. So this is a goddess worm with its proboscis not extruded. And this is a picture of it extruded. It wants to bite me because I was touching it. And the teeth are at the end of that, which is just really crazy. And that was the first spark for me about even paying any attention to marine worms because suddenly I thought, oh my gosh, these things can bite? What else can they do? And the more I looked into them, the more I realized that they can be really, really beautiful. This is a fan worm, and a lot of fan worms have these beautiful colors and patterns, and they are filter feeders, so they're going out, and all of these feather-looking structures are pulling plankton out of the water and then sucking it back into their little cave. They create their own calcium structure that looks like a little tube encrusted on a rock. And when they want to hide, they just pull themselves all the way back into that hard tube. And then when they want to feed, they will pull themselves back out and stick out those feathers. All right, a type of fan worm that we can find all the time in the Gulf of Maine. You find it washed up on the beach, you find it in the water, you find it on the rocks, is this tiny, tiny tube worm called Spirobus spirobus. And if you zoom in on these little spirals, they're each like little calcium shells. You will see the tiny little feathery structures sticking out of each one, trying to get those tiny little microscopic plankton and nutrients. So if you ever find some Spirobus spirobus, I would definitely say put it in some water and then look at it with a hand lens, and you can try to see all those little structures coming out to feed. All right. And then flatworms. This is my last worm slide, and we're almost done with the whole species. But usually when I think of flatworms, or at least a few years ago, I was immediately grossed out because I thought of like parasitic flatworms in humans, and I was like, that's disgusting. I don't want to see that. And I still think it's disgusting. However, not all flatworms are parasites. A lot of them are free living. They live in the ocean, they live in the intertidal zone, and they're just doing their thing. Flatworms can be really beautiful. They can be really brightly colored or patterned, and that is something to appreciate. And I also think that flatworms can be really cute because they have these little eye spots that look like funny eyeballs. And these are not eyes in the sense that we have eyes. They cannot really see like color or shapes, but they can see light and dark. So if you find a flatworm, find it by picking up a rock and there's a flatworm on the bottom because they like to stay in the dark. And as soon as you turn over that rock, it will crawl to the bottom of the rock because it says, oh my gosh, I'm in the light. And then you flip it again and it crawls to the bottom and you flip it again. And it'll just keep going always to the dark to hide. So if you find those flatworms, these two were both in the Gulf of Maine, I believe, or at least the left one was. And they're pretty, I think they're pretty cute. All right, this is the last type of critter that we're going to talk about for tonight. And this is the bryozoans. Maybe you've heard of them, maybe you haven't. Again, one that on the surface doesn't really look very exciting. It's kind of nondescript. They are hard organisms that kind of encrust on like a rock or on a seaweed. However, if you take a closer look, you will notice they are quite beautiful. They grow in this honeycomb-like structure of a colony where each tiny rectangle is an individual animal. And if you zoom in even farther, you can see that each animal has its own little set. It's called a crown of tentacles that comes out from that little rectangle and sweeps the water to try to get food and then goes back in for protection if it wants to hide. And again, these pictures, you can see them with a naked eye. So I encourage you, if you see a bryozoan, try to take a look a little bit closer. But I also encourage, find a hand lens or find a microscope that you can use to look a little bit closer. All right. That was a lot of information about a lot of animals. I hope at least some of it was intriguing to you or maybe surprising. And for the next couple minutes, I'm going to talk a little bit more about if you want to go tide pooling on your own. So maybe this summer or maybe tomorrow. I don't know how excited you are, but just some tips and tricks for you. So for safety and etiquette, first off, really important to always know the tide. I'm sure many of you already live in Maine, you have to know the tide, but making sure you're checking, there's websites, there's apps, there's books that you can look out to see these tides, and making sure that if you go, don't set your backpack down if the tide's coming in because it's going to get swept away, that sort of thing. When you are moving around on the intertidal zone, it's a lot of seaweed and it's really slippery. And it's important to move slowly and have multiple points of contact. I always tell my students, don't be afraid to look like a spider monkey or something like a crazy crab. Use your feet, but also use your hands, use your elbows, use your butt, like any sort of contact that will help you stabilize in the intertidal zone. As you hopefully saw in this presentation, it pays to look closely at these animals because sometimes they're really, really cool up close that you might not notice right off the bat. So if you're looking at, you turn over a rock, maybe take an extra 10, 15, 20 seconds to look closely because often you'll find things that you didn't see right away. If you decide to hold a creature, making sure that you hold them properly. So if it's a fish, put it in some water, right? If it's a crab, maybe don't pick it up and then stand up with it, because if that crab runs off your hand, it's going to fall like 100 times its height versus stay squatted down to the ground or be kneeling so that the crab doesn't have far to fall. Always returning creatures to their home when you're finished looking at them. So I always like to use the example of the limpet, right? That grinds its little shell in to make its own home. If you bring it even 20, 30, 40 feet away, it might not find its way back. We don't know. So just be nice to those creatures and put them back where you found them. And then finally, making sure you are lifting rocks gently and responsibly so that you don't squish your finger, so you don't squish your friend's finger, so you don't squish the creatures. With my students, I have them feel the size of their head, get really familiar with it, and then I say, you can't pick up any rocks bigger than your head because you can't control them very well. So that's a good rule of thumb to go by. And then finally, where to find some of these creatures. Again, go at low tide. There's going to be more exposed for you to explore. And then don't be afraid to pull back what we call the seaweed curtain. Use your hands. Your hands are not going to stay clean if you're tide pooling. You have to touch the seaweed and kind of reveal what's underneath it, because the creatures that are out are not going to just be sitting out in the open for everybody to see. They want to hide. So in order to find them, you need to look under the seaweed. You need to turn over rocks. Don't be afraid to dig in the mud. If that's your thing, it can be really, really fun. And there's certain critters that only live in mud flats that you can't find elsewhere. And if you want to use a dip net or like a small fishing net, you can use that to kind of squeeze water through and then see if you get any fish. And finally, if you are interested in finding creatures on the bottom of a dock, it's called dock fowling. The people in this photo are, doing some dock fowling at night, looking for bioluminescent plankton and squid. But you can do it at any time during the day, and you're going to find different sorts of animals that live on the bottom of a dock than you would in the intertidal zone. Because technically, if it's a floating dock, it's always underwater, right? The bottom is always underwater. So it's technically subtidal or below low tide. And the animals that live in that area, you can't find in the intertidal. So you're going to find things like skeleton shrimp or maybe nudibranchs or other things that you might not see in the intertidal zone. All right. And then tools of the trade. If you are going to go out, make sure you're wearing some sort of shoes that you don't mind getting wet, whether those be boots or sandals. I don't recommend going barefoot because barnacles are really sharp and they will cut the bottom of your feet. Be sure to be mindful of if you're bringing your phone with you, have it in a zipped pocket or don't bring it at all, because you don't want to be enjoying the intertidal zone and then your phone falls out and then you're stressed about that. So making sure that you're mindful of that. And then if you want to bring tools with you, like bowls or buckets or containers or nets, making sure you're using them properly. If you put a whole bunch of critters in one bowl, there's a possibility that some of those creatures might eat each other or pull off limbs. So if you think that might happen, go ahead and separate those creatures so that you don't hurt them while looking at them. And then providing some sort of shade for those creatures so that they don't have that effect where the water starts to evaporate, the oxygen level plummets, right, if they're in that bowl of water. So either providing shade for that or just changing out the water every few minutes is even better. And then using field guides and iNaturalist. I talk a little bit more about that in one moment, or a hand lens. But this is to say, with these tools, you really don't need fancy things to go out and explore the intertidal zone. You don't have to have any of these things to see some of the critters and to appreciate out there. All right. So if you'd like to learn more, my best piece of advice for you is to go explore. Just get out there. Even if you think you don't know a lot or you don't know where to start, just explore. You'll find things. Check out iNaturalist, which is a citizen science-based platform that helps you kind of identify species. And also check out some field guides. If you like paper field guides, I put some of my favorites for specifically the Gulf of Maine. And then there's also some websites that you can check out that have a lot of photos and more information about the species. All right. And that is it. And I want to thank you all for coming. I had a really good time, and I hope you learned something or came away with some curiosity, maybe. If you want to reach me for any reason, you can find my email right there. You can learn more about my work at Hog Island Audubon, and if you want to check out Hog Island, the camps that we run, you can at the website there. And if you're interested in my art as an illustrator, you can check out my art Instagram. All right. Now it is time for.
Heck yeah, Amanda, that was awesome. I have a bunch of questions for you.
Oh, amazing.
Yes, absolutely. Can you share with us, how does a limpet navigate back to its happy home?
That's a good question. I would imagine by some sort of like chemical trail that they're maybe able to follow, but I don't know the full answer to that. So I would want to research it before I give like a solid answer. It's a great question.
Okay. Are all barnacles male? And I think that's because of the slide that you shared.
I don't think so, but there are a lot of invertebrates that are hermaphrodites, which is like they're both male and female at the same time. Yep. So maybe barnacles are one of those. It gets so mucky when you're talking about invertebrates because they're wild. Again, I would need to look up, but yeah, I think no.
Awesome. This is a good question. This is so interesting. I live in Woolwich, and there is very active marine worm digging here in Wiscasset. Are you going to show the worms that they dig for? Like, did you, when I know you gave us an in-depth worm section. I was just wondering, yeah.
The words, I guess to clarify, the humans, the type of worms that humans are looking for when they dig, I think is what they're meaning.
Yeah, I think perhaps.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, yes, thank you. Yep.
Okay. I would assume it'd be like clam worms or maybe acorn worms or peanut worms. They're really fatty and maybe they're good fishing bait. So maybe people are trying to pull them up for that. I have not done any worm like harvesting. I've just done it for learning purposes. So I'm not sure what people are necessarily after, but my guess would be like peanut worms or acorn worms.
Cool. Was that a horseshoe crab you were holding in one of the promotional photos? And do you find many fossils? And then also, did there not used to be a variety of starfish in tide pools? Bunch of questions, all wrapped up.
Good questions. Good questions. Yes, that was a horseshoe crab that I was holding. Usually I've spent 2 summers going on 3 in Maine. And I only find like 1, 2, maybe 3 horseshoe crabs per summer, and that's living on an island where I'm at the intertidal zone pretty often. But that said, if you're in maybe a better environment for them, because they really like muddy areas, so if you have a mud flat near you, you might be finding more of them. And then the other question, variety of sea stars. Yes, it's really sad. There's been a huge loss of biodiversity in the past couple decades in the Gulf of Maine and on the eastern coast because of the invasive green crab. And they're competing for food and like the same environment, the same habitat. And they're also preying upon some of the same prey that sea stars need. So we've seen a drastic decline of sea stars. I have only ever found 1 live sea star in my time in Maine, and I wish I could say I found more.
Wow. Amanda, will you share a little bit about horseshoe crabs and like how old are they and where is the best place or time to find them?
Yeah, horseshoe crabs are so crazy. They are like living fossils. I want to say millions of years old, but I'm really bad with numbers, so I would need to double check that. The best time to find them, they follow the moon cycle actually. So they will come up and they will all spawn at the same time in, I believe it's spring, so like April, May-ish. Along certain places in the East Coast, like Cape Cod, is a really like famous spot to go see the horseshoe crabs, and they will come up at a certain time. I don't remember if it's full moon or new moon, but they follow those cycles. And the birds, the shorebirds that eat horseshoe crab eggs, they also follow those cycles because they know that the horseshoe crabs are going to lay their eggs at that time, and they meet them there basically and eat the eggs. They depend on that as well.
Someone just shared that New Jersey is the horseshoe crab capital of the world. Very
amazing.
Cool.
That is.
So we have just a few more moments. If folks have questions, you can either put it in the chat or ask Amanda directly by taking yourself off mute. Either works for us. We'll just have a few more minutes. This was fantastically informative. Yay! I love this stuff. So thank you so much for all of this.
Mm-hmm.
Really fun.
I hope that some of you are able to go out and find some of these creatures on your own, which would be really cool.
We have the Rachel Carson Preserve, which is just spectacular. It's like,
yes, that was actually where I found my one and only sea star. Was at that. Yeah. Cool.
Well, Amanda.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. I'm sorry. I was a little bit late for your talk, and You're sorry I missed the beginning in that kind of way, but I'm always curious about Hog Island. And there was always a kind of a report that it was at one point, it was connected to Louds Island or Muscongas Island. Do you know when the water washed through to create two islands?
Oh, that would be like even more like geologic time. I don't know like when, but a long time ago. I do know we have a famous shell heap from the Wabanaki peoples on the end of Hog Island that is near that connection to Louds Island. And so we're thinking that archaeologists are thinking it might have been connected, and that shell heap was a part of that. But as far as timing, I am not sure.
How long would you estimate that it'll take between that long bite out of the island of Hog Island between the north and the south? How long do you think it'll take to wash through to create two islands out of Hog Island?
Oh, that's a good question too. If you're not familiar, Hog Island kind of has a little inlet, and there's like a mini island and a bigger island, and they're connected by a little peninsula. I would say, I mean, it's not in my lifetime, I wouldn't think. So at least a couple, maybe over 100 years, maybe a couple 100 years. However, we have been seeing with like sea level rise, the erosion on the side of Hog Island, and we're pretty alarmed at it because it's a serious thing where our island is washing away and kind of pinching off where that peninsula is. So with that said, maybe it's going to be sooner than later. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much.
Of course.
You wonderful people. Any more questions out there for Amanda? It's our chance before summer comes and we can go get our feet wet.
I would like to just simply mention that, Amanda, the dories, of course, that you use to get on different islands were built by the Carpenter's boat shop.
That's so cool. Really? I didn't know that. Well, thank you. Thank you all. Yeah, you did that. If any of you are interested in having a copy of the slides for like the resources or for some of the animals, I can also send that to Alicia and she can forward it to everyone.
Absolutely. Y'all, this was a wonderful evening. I love the diversity of what we talk about. And Amanda, I can't thank you enough. I learned so much. I'm so excited for spring, and I really appreciate everything you shared with us. So thank you, and we'll see you all soon. Thanks very much.
All right.